Hello, and welcome back to another video. Today, we will be looking at California horror stories. If you like the content, be sure to leave a like, subscribe, and comment down below what horror stories you want to see next. Our first story today is called The Golden Plague. It started in San Francisco. People said it was the fog that brought it. Thick and damp, the kind that rolled in off the bay and swallowed the city whole. Tourists joked about it, locals shrugged it off, but then the headlines began. Mysterious illness sweeps Tenderloin District. At first, it seemed like just another flu strain, aggressive but manageable. Then came the bite marks. Dr. Evelyn Park was among the first to notice the pattern. Working double shifts in the ER at St. Gabriel's, she'd treated over a dozen cases in just one night. People arrived with bloodshot eyes, trembling hands, and a desperate hunger that made them lash out at anyone who came close. Most were homeless, others young tech workers, their lives intersecting in the city's labyrinth of late-night bars and forgotten alleyways. But what chilled Evelyn most was their silence. They didn't scream or cry in pain, they just stared. The first true attack happened on a Saturday afternoon in Golden Gate Park. Families had gathered for picnics. Joggers weaved through the trails. A man, naked, his body mottled with strange dark bruises, staggered into a playground. When a concerned father approached to help, the man lunged, tearing into his throat. The father's screams carried over the sound of children's laughter. Chaos erupted as the infected man attacking others, biting and clawing. By the time police arrived, 8 people were dead, and the infected had vanished into the trees. Evelyn watched the news footage in horror from the hospital break room. Her phone buzzed incessantly with emergency alerts, but no one knew what to call it yet. It wasn't a virus, not officially, not yet. By the time the CDC issued a containment order, it was too late. The bridges were packed with cars, families fleeing toward Marine or Oakland. Evelyn stayed, compelled by duty and trapped by the growing chaos. She couldn't leave the patients she promised to save, even as the city outside devolved into madness. 3 days later, San Francisco was unrecognizable. The streets were choked with abandoned vehicles and bodies. Fires burned unchecked, their smoke blending with the perpetual fog. Evelyn's hospital became a fortress, its doors barricaded with gurneys and medical carts. Survivors trickled in, some bitten, others bearing tales of entire neighborhoods consumed by roaring hordes. It wasn't until Evelyn saw the infected up close that she understood the true horror. They weren't just mindless monsters. Their eyes still held flashes of awareness, fleeting moments of humanity drowned beneath an insatiable need. She saw it in the way they hesitated, just briefly before attacking. They knew what they were doing, they just couldn't stop. "They're still in there," Evelyn whispered one night as she stitched up a bite victim. Her colleague, Dr. Samir Patel, shook his head grimly. "Whatever they were, they're gone now," he said. "We have to focus on the living." But Evelyn couldn't shake the thought. What if they weren't gone? What if they were trapped? 1 week into the outbreak, Evelyn's hospital became a target. The infected came at night, swarming the barricades with a terrifying collective precision. Their moans echoed through the halls, a low, mournful sound that made her skin crawl. Security guards fired into the crowd, but it was like trying to hold back the tide. When the glass doors finally shattered, Evelyn and the other survivors fled to the upper floors, sealing themselves in with whatever they could find. That was when Evelyn's world began to truly collapse. Supplies dwindled, the power went out, people turned on each other, suspicion and desperation gnawing away at their humanity. Evelyn tried to hold them together, but the fear was contagious, and then the infected broke through. Evelyn barely escaped, sprinting through darkened corridors with the screams of her colleagues ringing in her ears. She fled into the city, now a labyrinth of ruin and ash. She didn't know where she was going. She only knew she couldn't stop. Days blurred into nights as Evelyn wandered. She scavenged food from looted stores, slept in abandoned offices, and avoided the infected at all costs. But what haunted her the most wasn't the monsters. It was the silence. San Francisco had always been alive with noise. Horns honking, people shouting, music spilling from open windows. Now the only sounds were her own ragged breaths and the distant guttural groans of the infected. She found a group of survivors near the Embarcadero, hiding in the shell of a ferry terminal. They welcomed her warily, their faces hollow with hunger and grief. Together, they planned to escape the city by boat, hoping to find refuge on Angel Island. But as they prepared to leave, Evelyn noticed something strange. The infected were gathering along the shoreline, dozens of them standing motionless in the shallow water, their eyes fixed on the horizon. It was as if they were waiting for something. "What are they doing?" one of the survivors whispered. Evelyn didn't have an answer, but as the infected began to move, wading deeper into the bay, a terrible realization struck her. They weren't mindless at all. They were learning. The ferry terminal erupted into chaos as the infected swarmed the dock. Evelyn fought her way onto the boat, blood and seawater splashing across her scrubs. As the ferry pulled away, she watched the city shrink into the distance, its skyline a jagged silhouette against a burning city. But Evelyn knew they hadn't escaped. Not really. The infected weren't bound by the rules of the living. They'd find a way across the water. They always did. As the ferry churned toward the horizon, Evelyn clutched the railing, her hands trembling. The Golden Gate had become a gate to hell, and California's golden dream was now a nightmare she could never wake from. For our next horror story, we will stay in California, and this story is called The Whispering Cliffs. The jagged cliffs of Mendocino were always veiled in a shroud of mist, a natural beauty hiding a darker, untold story. Locals spoke of the cliffs in hushed tones, warning visitors not to linger after sunset. But for Alina Alvarez, a struggling photographer desperate for a breakthrough, the warnings felt more like a challenge than a deterrent. Elena had driven up from Los Angeles in search of inspiration. Her portfolio was filled with sunsets, cityscapes, and mundane still lifes. Beautiful but soulless. She needed something new, something raw, something that told a story. When she stumbled across an old postcard of the Mendocino Cliffs in an antique shop, she knew where she needed to go. The cliffs were hauntingly beautiful, with waves crashing against the rocks far below and an aura that seemed almost otherworldly. Her first day there was uneventful. The light wasn't right, and the mist swallowed most of her shots. Frustrated but determined, she decided to stay until she captured something truly unique. She rented a small creaky cabin a mile from the cliffs and planned to return at dawn. But as night fell, the cabin's isolation began to wear on her. The wind howled outside, rattling the old windows, and the distant sound of waves seemed almost like whimpers. Unable to sleep, Elena reviewed the day's photos on her laptop. Most were blurry, unremarkable. But one image caught her attention. It was a shot of the cliffs taken just before she packed up. At first glance, it seemed normal. Gray rocks, swirling mist, the churning sea below. But in the corner of the frame, almost obscured by the fog, was a figure. Elena leaned closer, her breath catching. It was a woman, pale and ghostly, dressed in what looked like a flowing white gown. Her face was turned toward the sea, but her body language seemed wrong, twisted, as though she were mid-fall but frozen in time. Elena felt a chill creep up her spine. She hadn't seen anyone on the cliffs that day. Shaking off her unease, she convinced herself it was a trick of the light or her overactive imagination. But she couldn't stop staring at the figure. As the night wore on, she began to hear things, faint whispers, indistinct but insistent. Carried on the wind, they seemed to be coming from outside. When the whispers didn't stop, Elena grabbed her flashlight and stepped onto the porch. The night was cold and damp, the air heavy with the smell of salt and earth. The wind tugged at her hair, and the trees swayed like shadowy figures. She shone the flashlight around, but saw nothing unusual. Still, the whispers persisted, growing louder, more urgent. They seemed to be calling her back to the cliffs. Elena hesitated. The warnings from the locals rang in her ears, but her curiosity won out. She grabbed her camera and drove a short distance to the trailhead, her headlights cutting through the dense fog. The path to the cliffs was treacherous, but she moved quickly, the whispers guiding her every step. When she reached the edge, the whispers stopped. The silence was deafening, broken only by the distant roar of the waves. Elena set up her tripod, her hands trembling. She took a few test shots, but the mist was too thick to capture anything clearly. Frustrated, she lowered the camera and stared out at the sea. That's when she saw her. The woman from the photograph stood at the edge of the cliff, her back to Elena. Her gown billowed in the wind, but she didn't move. Heart pounding, Elena called out, but the woman didn't respond. Slowly, Elena raised her camera and snapped a picture. The flash illuminated the figure for a split second, and Elena's breath caught in her throat. The woman had no face. Elena stumbled backward, her foot slipping on the loose gravel. When she looked up again, the woman was gone. The whispers returned, louder now, circling her like a swarm of bees. She felt a sudden pressure in her chest, as though the air itself were conspiring against her. Desperate, she grabbed her camera and ran, not stopping until she reached her car. Back at the cabin, Elena locked the doors and pulled the curtains shut. Her hand shook as she reviewed the photo. The woman was there, clearer this time, her faceless head tilted slightly as if acknowledging the camera. But behind her in the mist were more figures. Dozens of them, their forms barely visible but unmistakably human. Elena didn't sleep that night. The whispers grew louder, more distinct. They weren't just sounds anymore, they were words, pleading and angry, overlapping in a cacophony that threatened to drive her mad. Help us. Join us. It's your turn. By dawn, Elena had made a decision. She couldn't leave, not yet. She needed answers. She returned to the cliffs, this time with a purpose. The whispers guided her again, but they felt different now, almost welcoming. When she reached the edge, the mist parted, revealing the sheer drop to the jagged rocks below. And there they were, the figures from her photos, standing in the silent row along the cliff's edge. The faceless woman stood at the center, her head tilted as if waiting for Elena. Compelled by a force she couldn't explain, Elena stepped closer. The whispers filled her head, drowning out her thoughts, her fears. She raised her camera one last time and took a final picture. The flash illuminated the figures, and for the briefest moment she saw their faces. They were people, ordinary, terrified people, and then they were gone. Elena lowered the camera and stared at the cliff's edge. The whispers had stopped. The air was still. For the first time since arriving in Mendocino, she felt completely at peace. When the locals found her car a week later, they assumed she'd fallen. Tourists did that sometimes, wandering too close to the edge. But when her camera was recovered, the photos told a different story. The last image was a haunting, crystal clear shot of the cliffs. The mist had lifted, revealing dozens of figures standing along the edge. At the center was a woman in white, her faceless head turned toward the camera, and just behind her, barely visible in the haze, was Elena.